morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be on the globe. I am Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and Director of External Affairs for our Friends of Ukraine Network. Welcome to our webinar, Vilnius, Historic Opportunity, Taken or Squandered. Yesterday, here in the United States, we have celebrated our 247th Independence Day. Our forefathers fought their Revolutionary War for their and our independence and freedom. In light of Russia's war against Ukraine and our topic today, it's worth noting, I believe, that 247 years ago, our forefathers had foreign support and assistance in that revolution. France provided supplies, arms, ammunition, uniforms, and troops and naval support to the Continental Army. In this light fight for independence and freedom, Ukraine needs our support on the battlefield, for the battlefield, and in the NATO summit. To discuss this situation, we have a fabulous panel. I will make very brief introductions and then get the conversation going. General Philip Breedlove, U.S. Air Force, retired, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, NATO, distinguished professor at the Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Institute of Technology. General Breedlove is driving today, so he's going to be a mobile attendee. Debra Cagan is a senior advisor to the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, distinguished fellow at Transatlantic Leadership Network, and a former senior official in both Department of State and the Department of Defense. Luke Coffey is senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. His work analyzes national security and foreign policy with a focus on Europe, Eurasia, NATO, and transatlantic relations. Ambassador John Herbst is Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, former ambassador to Ukraine and to Uzbekistan, and he's chairman of the Friends of Ukraine Network's National Security Task Force. And I'm going to struggle with this, but Ambassador Žygimantas, Chair, Committee of Foreign Affairs for the Lithuanian Parliament and former Lithuanian ambassador to the United States and Mexico. The ambassador hasn't come on yet, but we will introduce him as soon as he does so. But with him not being here yet, General Breedlove, you recently visited a number of European countries, talking about Ukraine, listening to our allies. What's your sense of how things are shaping up before the Vilnius summit?
Well, first of all, Bob, thank you for having me aboard. To the audience, I apologize for my informality, but even the Friends of Ukraine Network doesn't displace my family when they call. So today I'm on a family errand, and I will do my very best to contribute to our webinar. Bob, I think two things leap out to me from the visit to four capitals across 16 days. And the first one is there is a sense, even among old Europe, of unease about what this summit will accomplish. And it's mostly in the form of concern about the message. Will what NATO does send the appropriate signal to both Mr. Putin and his military, as well as to the world and the leaders in Ukraine? There is a desire that we get as far forward as we can in our dialogue in assuring Ukraine's path to being an ally, but most importantly, that we get far enough in the language and the statements that says Ukraine will eventually be an ally, and we will be a part of ensuring existence. I do sadly report that that no one expects that they will be offered their membership at this meeting. There seems to have been enough of the sort of not accepting that conversation, especially among leading nations like the United States, that many believe that that will not be offered. But there is also a fairly clear indication from many, not all four I visited, but from many, that should happen at Vilnius. So I think that the first big message I would carry is that, and I hate to keep using the word, but everybody is in concern that the appropriate message is sent, that Mr. Putin sees that NATO is firm in its intention to bring Ukraine aboard at the appropriate time. And I think that discussion is that appropriate time is really the key to our concerns and conversations. The second thing that came up in all four capitals, and I hate to get down in the weeds, but it is a very tactical thing, and that is there is an intense conversation in the four capitals I visited, and I think in many others, that they're watching what Russia has done to the Ukraine via cruise missiles, and drones, and the sort of indiscriminate damage that Russia has made in Ukraine. And many of them see themselves as vulnerable to the same sort of attack. I'm not going to be critical of any one nation because my own nation is guilty as well. Across the last several decades, especially since the fall of the wall and the period that I describe as hugging the bear, trying to bring Russia to the West, all nations have invested, or shall we say, underinvested in air defense. So I just wanted to remind all of the conversations we had some years ago when the EPAA was sort of begun, and that is the two sites in Romania and Poland, and their ability to take on tactical ballistic missiles. And during that time, nations clearly had a misunderstanding of how that whole network works. And we had to do a series of exercises to point out that it was first and foremost not a 100% probability of kill. And second of all, that depending on where you were in the pattern of coverage by those two radars, your PK could be, probability of kill could be lower than your neighbor who is in a different part of the pattern. And we discussed broadly in NATO that the density of the sensors had the most impact on improved performance, and then the density of the shooters hooked into the network would have a lot of impact on the performance. And what we found at the time was, once we got those up, the worry about this kind of threat went way down. People lost interest in investing in connecting to the network and buying sensors to increase the density, and even more so buying shooters to be a part of the network. Well, now what we have is people asking me, because I was around at that time trying to get everybody to understand it, what does it take to make me more defendable in the face of this Russian onslaught of very poorly performing as far as accuracy missiles that have done so much damage to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine? And how do I not become a target like Ukraine has that gets pounded continually by these missiles? Now, we all know that Ukraine is getting better and better and better, but the fact of the matter is Russia's damage due to these long-range fires, both from aircraft in the surrounding airspace and surface-to-launch capabilities, including repurposed surface-to-air missiles. There is a great concern now how people might be better connected to the defense network, how they might better benefit from the information that is available on the NATO NATNADS, which is the NATO system, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to close with that there seems growing interest in all things defense, but certainly catching up on decades of lack of investment on air and missile defense.
Bill, I'm going to move on until you get to another tower. You might add, I think we got that central point. Luke, I'll turn to you. You've been following developments, and you and Sandy Hirschbaum published an excellent piece, Advanced Witness. Any sense your suggestions have been taking root or whatever?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me on today for organizing this. Heading into the NATO summit next week, my biggest concern is that expectations are running high by everyone. Well, perhaps not everyone, but certainly with the Ukrainians, expectations are high. And certainly amongst the policy communities in the different capitals, the expectations are high. And I feel like the U.S. government and perhaps a few other European governments haven't done a good job managing these expectations and working on the narrative that is needed to make sure that this summit is seen to be a success. We don't know what's going to come out of the summit when it comes to Ukraine, other than that we know Ukraine will not be invited to join the alliance, so there's no consensus for that. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we will see a clearer path for Ukraine to someday get into the alliance. This could be in the form of the alliance announcing the beginning process of a study that would ultimately lead to a document outlining the benchmarks for Ukrainian membership. This would be kicking it into the long grass approach, but it could be one that is taken. I've also heard that the language about the membership action plan being required for this process of Ukrainian membership might be scrapped. For those watching who aren't familiar with what the membership action plan is, or MAP as it's referred to, the MAP process was designed to create a process for aspirant countries to join the alliance. There's no legal requirement for a country to complete one of these maps. There's no mention of MAP in the founding document, the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty. This is an artificial construct that was designed in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War to help usher in new countries in Central and Eastern Europe into the alliance. The big concern with MAP is that it's now used as a political football, where countries aren't getting maps presented to them at a summit that is being seen as a sign of failure or a sign of disinterest by the alliance to bring certain members in to NATO. And I think it'd be wise to get rid of the MAP process altogether, especially in the case of Ukraine. I think the membership action plan MAP process worked really well in the aftermath of the Cold War for the more straightforward countries in Central and Eastern Europe to join, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, etc. But the remaining aspirant countries have very complex and almost unique geopolitical circumstances, which requires a more tailored approach. So I would like to see the whole concept of MAP removed, replaced with something that's more specific to each candidate country. I'm not sure if we'll get that at the upcoming summit, but I think we might get the scrapping of the MAP process. I'm not sure we'll get something to replace it, but I think we might see MAP not being mentioned in the context of Ukraine joining the alliance. For the summit to be a success for Ukraine, I think two things have to happen. We have to have stronger language than what was used in 2008, 15 years ago at the Bucharest summit, when the possibility of Ukraine joining the alliance was first mentioned. The wording has to be stronger, the messaging has to be stronger. And then also we need to, so that's the first thing that needs to happen. The second thing that needs to happen is we need NATO to announce some practical measures to enhance the NATO-Ukrainian relationship until Ukraine finally becomes a member of NATO. A few ideas I've been proposing include a joint center of excellence for modern warfare, where NATO and Ukraine would create the center to study the lessons learned from the conflict in Ukraine, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This would be a way for the NATO flag and the Ukrainian flag to fly alongside one another and before Ukraine finally joins the alliance. Another proposal I've had is for NATO to create a what I call a train today for tomorrow program, where NATO would gather a pot of money to be used to train Ukrainians on weapons systems and weapons platforms that we may have no plan to give Ukraine now, but we might in the future. So at least when we finally decide to give these weapons to Ukraine, we'll have some Ukrainians already trained on how to operate and maintain them. Had we done this a year ago, the rollout of Patriot would have been faster. The rollout of Abrams and Leopards and Challengers would have been faster. And they could possibly be flying F-16s right now. So we need to think more long-term in that sense. Finally, I just want to offer a cautionary note when it comes to the ongoing counteroffensive by Ukraine against Russian forces to liberate their territory and the NATO summit. We should resist the temptation to link success or failure or shortcomings of Ukraine's counteroffensive to the success or failure of the NATO summit. These should be seen as two separate issues. And we should be patient with Ukraine's counteroffensive and realize that we will not know for months whether or not this counteroffensive was a success or a failure. Everyone has this tendency these days to hop on Twitter and look at a photograph of a Bradley burning and declare that the counteroffensive has been a failure. We saw this play out also last year around the counteroffensive to liberate Kherson. We need to be patient, let the Ukrainians do what they got to do. We need to continue to support them along the way and remain calm and check back in the fall to see whether or not it was a success or failure. But we should not try linking tactical battlefield successes in Eastern Ukraine to strategic outcomes at the NATO summit in Vilnius.
Well, thank you, Luke. I'm not sure what's happened to Ambassador Pavilionis. We communicated over the weekend, so something has happened. I want to mention a couple of things about what he wanted to talk about before we go on to our next speaker. The ambassador headed a delegation of foreign policy chairmen of legislators of NATO countries to Washington a few weeks ago. They had a message for our administration about supporting Ukraine in Vilnius. And, you know, it was quite, let's see if I've got this where I can show it here. This letter came, and there were about 9 members of the delegation, but they were representing 23 chairmen of legislators, NATO member legislators, including Great Britain, France, Poland, Italy, Germany, and the United States, I might add. And it was pretty darn impressive. And they had a lot of meetings, and I wanted to have him talk about their impressions of what they learned and what they've heard since. I'm scrolling down so you briefly can see who all signed this thing and from which countries. It was an impressive group. And I mean, noteworthy because these chairmen of these foreign policy committees in the legislatures of NATO members, 23 NATO members, were here asking the United States to lead in supporting Ukraine's membership in NATO. So we will we'll get back to that if the ambassador gets on. But it was an impressive group. They were very impressive in their conversations that I was a part of. And it's kind of an interesting thing. All these countries coming here and asking the United States to please lead. Having said that, let's turn to Debra Cagan. You know, Debra, among Friends of Ukraine National Security Task Force, you probably more than anybody else are in communications with officials here in Washington and all across Europe more consistently than anybody else. And as the summit is starting to begin coming into clearer focus, is it a historic opportunity that will be taken or not, Debra?
I think that going back several months ago, actually last year, there was this wake-up call in NATO, particularly when the wayward drones flew and then the detritus from air defense missiles. And what NATO found out was that there was no early warning. So these things just fell and there was no early warning at all. And the Croatians, who were the first victim of this, went to NATO and said, where's our vaunted, integrative air defense? And it was missing. And I think this realization started actually several months ago, before even the Russians started throwing the kitchen sink with its launches, multiple launches per day against Ukraine. So I think that was a really important point. And I think this coalition of countries in NATO looking now how to change air and air defense is long overdue, but absolutely has to happen. And sometimes this sort of lull, I mean, I'm going back historically, post-Vietnam, the United States just sat on its hands on its military and then spent the next 15 years trying to figure out how to catch up for lost time. And I think NATO, as General Breedlove described, is in a similar situation where too many countries bought into this peace narrative and the dividend of the end of the Cold War, and now they're going to have to make up for it. So on a positive note, it's important that NATO is turning this corner and now taking the action it needs to take. I think there'll still be arguments over where the French are headed versus where the coalition of other countries are headed on this issue. There has been a lot in the press on this of late. And the French correctly point out that in the run to beef up NATO's air defense and air defense of all these other countries, there'll be a larger dependence on other countries that produce air defense more readily than NATO has been, at light speed, like Israel and others. And what the French correctly point out, and this is why I'm bringing this up, we've seen this in Ukraine, when you have to depend on a third country for re-export, things can get very gummed up in these works. And I bring this up because, as we know, Ukraine has not had access to ammunition for German weapons because of Switzerland. Germany now has cut off that contract with the Swiss, and they're going to start making this indigenously, but that's a little late in the game, but at least it's happening. And correctly, too, if you buy Arrow and other air defense systems from Israel, and let's say you want to transfer them to Ukraine, Israel will have a veto on whether that can happen. So far as we know, Israel has vetoed any equipment going to Ukraine. So I wanted to sort of launch into that, as this is not just as easy as saying, okay, we're going to invest in this and fix this, because the quick solution is to go buy this air defense equipment from other countries who already make it. We know how long it took South Korea to agree to actually send things to Ukraine. So this is just something to keep in the back of your head, that until indigenous defense industry gets ginned up to the point where it can make a lot of these things, there's still going to be issues about third country re-export and whether these can be used for other conflicts that these countries see as essential. So I wanted to get into that. A couple of other things on what Luke said is that I would just add on to what you said, Luke, is saying that we should not be in the business of defining success or failure for Ukraine. Let Ukraine define this. All of these pundits who are defining success or failure probably have not stepped foot in Ukraine in their entire lives, and certainly aren't on the ground now looking at what's happening. And so it's almost this level of presumptuousness and arrogance that you sitting thousands of miles away and never having looked at this battle space in your entire life are now defining what is success or failure for Ukraine. And I find that it would be laughable if it wasn't, but it's just not funny. So that's an important point. And then, of course, these things take on a life of their own and people go explaining them. So the next point I want to get to is we have to really be careful about describing the Russian military as incompetent. There has been a lot of that from the White House. There's been a lot of that from other countries about Russian failures. But I like to say even a dog has its day. And Russia has also learned from this conflict. And it has learned how to effectively jam a lot of Western equipment. It has learned its EW systems have been very effective. And we're going to have to quickly develop countermeasures to this, not only for Ukraine, but for ourselves and for the Indo-Pacific. And I think that is a valuable lesson learned here. But to assume that every Russian military official involved in this is incompetent is not fair, and it's not an accurate presentation. And so I've heard a lot of this, but frankly, there's still a number of highly trained Guards Airborne divisions who are involved in this conflict who are doing quite well. There's levels of competence within the Russian military now. I mean, the prisoners being on the low part of the scale, but there's still professional military people involved in this. And we should not fall into this trap of just assuming, as Luke said, that Ukraine is going to roll over them as if they're incompetent and they don't know what they're doing. Because some of them do know what they're doing. And we should not fall into this trap of just assuming that they're bad at their jobs. And this is beyond the concept of, the incredible numbers, the ratio of numbers involved here. The next point I want to make is going to the heart of the summit. Nothing happens here without U.S. leadership. And frankly, I think that our East European allies and other allies in Europe who were more forward-leaning on Ukraine and membership in NATO waited way too long for the U.S. to do something that did not happen and should have now sort of staked their own claim to doing their own leadership for this. It is getting really old and really tiring to see this, deflecting to or giving to nations who were the older part of Europe. I'm not insulting them. Some of them are very good, very competent, but I'm saying that it is time to start recognizing those countries east of Berlin and in the high north as having as much credibility, if not more so, on this than we have. And I fear that too many in the U.S. leadership continue to look at what the countries in Berlin and west of there feel more than they do the ones who are facing the threat every day. And it is always astonishing to me that the countries who are closest to that threat, including Lithuania and Poland, who sit on the border with Kaliningrad and face nuclear weapons every day, are less afraid of nuclear escalation than are people who are an ocean away. And that, to me, has unfortunately narrowly prescribed how far the U.S. and other countries have been willing to go for this summit. And it is unfathomable. I don't understand it. I've tried, as my colleagues here know, to sort of address that a number of times. But it is always interesting to me that the people who live in the neighborhood are less afraid and more willing to take very focused steps forward than are the ones who have, as I said, the safety of an ocean between them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Deborah. You added a lot to think about there. John Herbst, it's been sort of a tradition for me to call on you last, as you call yourself a utility infielder, but you have such broad perspective and so many insights into all the different moving parts. It seems that we call on you last to kind of pull things together and set up for questions from each other and the audience. John?
Okay, thanks, Bob. We've heard a lot of very smart things from my fellow panelists. Let me provide an optic which is consistent with what we've heard, but maybe does try and put a framework for understanding all this. First, we need to recognize what the challenge is. And the challenge is not simply Putin waging a war on Ukraine. Putin has great revisionist ambitions. And he has stated those ambitions on numerous occasions. Other Russian officials have as well. And they were put into those draft treaties that he sent to NATO and to Washington in December of 2021 before the big invasion. And he claims a right to have effective political control across the entire space of the former Soviet Union, which includes 3 NATO allies, plus another 13 countries. And he claims a right to at least influence the defense posture of the former Warsaw Pact states, another bunch of NATO countries. This is very dangerous for American security, for European security. And the place to stop Putin's revisionist ambitions, his threat to the United States, and for that matter to our NATO allies, is in Ukraine. And one problem with an overall adequate administration policy is a refusal to lay out the stakes so that the American people understand that the $55 billion of military and economic aid we've given to Ukraine last year and this year is actually just a small price to pay for American security, for American prosperity, which is very much based upon peace and strength in Europe. That's the first point. The second brings in both the war in Ukraine, the issue of weapons to Ukraine, and the NATO summit. I agree with Luke that we should not link the two as we look at what's happening on the battlefield and drawing conclusions. But I think the two issues are the two questions are naturally connected if you recognize the critical danger that Putin's foreign policy poses for American and European interests. We need to stop Putin by ensuring Ukraine gets all the weapons that it needs to win on the battlefield, and looking at the medium term and the longer term security in Europe to offer Ukraine a place in NATO. So that's a good way to look at the upcoming Vilnius summit. The Vilnius summit, if approached properly, going back 6 or 9 or even 11 months, would have given especially the Biden administration, keep in mind President Biden was a senator for 4 decades, considers himself a foreign policy maven. Well, foreign policy mavens have the ability to see great dangers and great opportunities. And President Biden certainly has understood that a Russian victory in Ukraine would be a disaster, which is why he's providing so much American support. And he has helped rally the alliance with additional partners to make sure that Putin cannot succeed. But you also need to understand, again, the opportunities. And the opportunity is to make sure that the authoritarian temptation, which is very much the challenge of the times, the authoritarian temptation, which the White House has properly identified, involves especially China and Russia, to a lesser extent Iran and North Korea, we need to smash this temptation. And the place to smash it is in Ukraine. And one way to do that is to make sure that the upcoming Vilnius summit states in very clear terms that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, that a path has now been identified and will be marched upon or walked along to make sure that Ukraine joins NATO soon. Sadly, just as the administration has wrung its hands over sending Ukraine all the weapons that it needs to conduct a smashingly successful counteroffensive, so they have been extremely timid in preparation for the Vilnius summit. Debra pointed out correctly that the neighbors of Russia, who historically have suffered at Moscow's hands, who in theory are the most vulnerable of our allies, get the Russians right, or get Putin right. And those NATO allies are calling for some form of timetable, not in the distant future, but in real time, to bring NATO closer to Ukraine. And I have very low expectations for Vilnius. The United States is the NATO leader. The United States played a critical role when I and Debra, for that matter, and Phil were young professionals in the early 80s, when President Reagan was in charge, in putting short-range ballistic missiles into Europe to deal with the large Soviet supply of such. There was unhappiness in Europe, but we managed to do it, which led, of course, to the INF Treaty in the late 80s, which pulled Russian short-range ballistic missiles out of Europe or out of Western Russia. We need to see something similar today, but we don't. In the preparations in Vilnius, the most timid members have not been France, not been the usual suspects, or maybe not one of the usual suspects, but Washington and Berlin, and of course, Budapest, but that's a class by itself. It's very sad to say as an American, but it happens to be true. Now, the fact that what I've just said is not a secret, it's been known for about 3 or 4 weeks, has the White House a little bit concerned. So they're now looking at maybe what else can be put on the table for the Vilnius summit. But it's going to be very thin gruel still, unless something dramatic happens in the next week. Luke spoke of getting rid of a map, and I think that's going to happen. That's really that's non-alcoholic beer. He's talked about as well. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the other point you made, Luke, which you're expecting, which may be true. But what needs to be done is a clear directive at this summit for NATO by the Washington summit next year to lay out the timeline for Ukraine's entry and to do things in the interim which enhance Ukraine's security. Some of Luke's ideas are excellent. Sandy Vershbow and Ian Brzezinski did a similar piece in April, laying out some thoughts. And I should mention that today appeared in Politico a public letter signed by many of the members of this call, laying out things that could be done in Vilnius, again, to secure Ukraine now and bring Ukraine into NATO in the not too distant future. That will certainly secure not just Ukraine's security, but American security, NATO security writ large, European security. Last point. Debra took this up, so I don't need to go into detail. The administration has sadly allowed Putin to intimidate it with threats of nuclear escalation. Debra's a nuclear expert. I'm not, but I was a diplomat as I watched us negotiate. Again, I talked about the INF Treaty. I talked about our ability to confront a more dangerous foe than Putin's Russia, the Soviet Union. They had nukes too. And we never said we cannot do X, we cannot do Y, because our adversary might start a nuclear war. The fact that a dozen times or more senior administration officials have said that means they don't understand history. The surest way to encourage the Kremlin to commit aggression is to suggest you can be intimidated by nuclear threats. If Putin were to succeed in Ukraine, because we do not send ATACMS because Putin says that's a red line, and Putin wins in Ukraine, we can expect the same tactics vis-a-vis our Baltic NATO allies, and maybe our Polish NATO allies. So this is a very bad game. Behavior unbecoming a superpower. Very dangerous. And with that, I think I've kicked up enough dust. For a utility infielder.
Phil, it looks to me like just you're ready to comment on a couple of things, and I want to catch you before you drive into some dead zone again.
I think I'm good because I'm pulling into my brother's property and we're still on the video. So I don't have anything specific to add other than I would love to foot stomp what Ambassador Herbst just said. I think that by showing weakness on a couple of these issues, we are inviting trouble as opposed to avoiding trouble. And that's something that this particular administration doesn't share our view, because we are, as I say in military parlance, I believe we are deterred in a big way as it relates to some of the issues we need to move forward. I'd like to go back to something that the administration has said over and over. They say we're going to give them everything they need. Well, let me tell you that the United States military would not go to war without air power, and it would not go to war without its long-range ammunition. So apparently we've decided that what they need is less than what we need when we go to war. And I think we need to begin to think along those terms. If we're truly committed to giving them everything they need, then we've got a ways to go. So the bottom line is, I think that, you know, the first and biggest step here as far as the counteroffensive is to really rethink what it is we're doing. And if we're going to give them everything they need to win this counteroffensive, we have stopped short, and we need to reassess that. And by the way, F-16s are not going to affect this counteroffensive, but they're the next step down the road. But ATACMS could be brought to bear in days. They already have all of the equipment to fire it. They already understand the firing mechanisms. They already understand exactly how they target, etc. And ATACMS can make a difference inside a week if we were to get them there. And so there's a few things that I think we need to press hard on this administration to reconsider in order to affect the current fight. Over.
Well, Phil, you brought up the ATACMS, and I know at least one person has an answer to this, but I'm going to raise it because of this particular forum. On a number of occasions recently, the people in the administration have said we just don't have them available. ATACMS aren't available. Comments on that, Deborah?
General, do you want to comment or? No.
Well, I would say that I think we need a more definitive answer from the Pentagon and the White House. If we are so critically short on ATACMS, then I would search the current budget and find out where we are on buying ATACMS, etc. I'm not saying that we're being deliberately misled or anything like that. I just think that we need a more definitive understanding of why this is the answer that is given. Have we underbought on ATACMS in the past? Have we underinvested in the line to produce ATACMS? And I would just press a little on this to understand why they're giving us that answer.
I'm less kind. We are being deliberately misled. They are being produced at a couple hundred a year now. And if we were so short of them, we wouldn't have just delivered a whole load of them over about a month ago to Poland. We wouldn't have delivered a whole load of them to Romania. And we continue to sell them to foreign buyers. And so that kind of belies the fact that we have shortages in the United States. And because they keep getting sold and new contracts are signed. So I think that the whole issue of what was in Army ready units for this, because the Army did not switch over to its new precision munitions as quickly as some had hoped, mostly because Army could make its decision on what range it wanted for those weapons. But there's not a shortage per se. If the US government were to say to the producer of ATACMS, we need you to have your next launch off the line go to Ukraine, that could happen in a heartbeat. So yes, I do think there is a misleading here. And if I might, before we sign off, I wanted to make one final comment on NATO and institutions and the like, including MAP. I know I'm rather long in the tooth, but I'm the first one to say that some of these ideas that are being promulgated by the White House and by some of the other countries are, forgive me, so last century, and they do not have any applicability to 2023. And just because you had an institution that was formed in the 90s doesn't mean that institution has any validity now. And what I mean by that is, don't hang on to something just because the bureaucracy of hanging on to an institution becomes more important than the practical effect of what that means. And the problem with NATO, and it's a problem in the United States and other governments with executive orders, there's no freaking sunset clauses. And you need sunset clauses because some of these institutions have clearly outlived their usefulness. We were okay at getting rid of some arms treaties that have outlived their usefulness. So similarly, there are things in NATO that just need to be thrown out. And that includes this keeping in place this figment of a Russia NATO council. I mean, that's ridiculous. So I would just say that we need to have a better look at, it's not that I'm opposed to tradition, it's just that I'm opposed to things that have outlived their usefulness, and you need to move on.
Well, I do note that in another forum, Dan Fried said that he and I forget who the other person was, are the ones that created MAP, and it was just a creation for the time. There's no reason it has to be looked at in the future or even referred to anymore. It was something created to serve a specific time and specific instances. So I think that getting rid of it has come up a number of times in this conversation. One of the questions we have here is that Senator Mark Kelly recently spoke in Phoenix following a trip to Ukraine. He stated that this war needs to end quickly, or if it does not, history records that it will, as with Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, just drag on for years. It seems all of you are saying that support needs to increase for this to happen. A key, I believe, is that, as you stated, supportive parties must do much better in controlling the narrative in U.S. media so that the middle class understands how important this is. I will comment and then I'll ask for other comments. The Friends of Ukraine Network puts out recommendations every year. The number one recommendation from the National Security Task Force this year, and it had been talking about it before that, is that the president has to state a policy goal. And we're with them for as long as it takes is not a goal. It's words that don't really have any message and meaning. Have to say We are with them until they win this war on their terms and explain it to the American people. The administration has not invested in that message and in what it calls for. Anybody else want to comment on that? We've all been saying it. Another question is, does Ukraine have the resources, facilities, infrastructure, manpower, womanpower to rotate their troops through battlefronts so battle fatigue doesn't take hold in Ukraine military with the detrimental impacts on morale, alertness, and performance? General, you want to comment on that?
Yes, I do. And let me just say that I think the Ukraine military is well led. I think they have what I call great general officership. It is improving all the time. We're beginning to see the demise of those who had the Soviet model central in their thought. And but they are fighting an existential fight, and their troops are fighting longer durations and more on the line than we would ask of our troops, I believe. And it is not because they don't care or don't understand it. It is a matter of requirement. So I believe there is some modicum of rotation and attempting to address this, but in the larger stance, their troops are going to be on the field longer. Now, in some places and cases, you have amazing support from the locals who are trying to make this better for them, but it's not an institutional thing, and it's not uniform across the front. And Bob, I got to excuse myself here in a minute. I got family standing outside giving me the what's up sign here. So if I just may say, thank you for having me. I think we have more policy work to do in the U.S. Capitol immediately to get the right support to Ukraine, and we need to keep the pressure on NATO to consider a very, with that, I'm going to depart. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and don't back into the tree. Safe driving. Okay.
I'm safe now. I'm in my parking spot.
Okay, thank you, Phil. I just before we continue a little bit more, I am really sorry that Ambassador from Lithuania, I don't have any idea. I haven't heard from him what's going on. As I say, we talked over the weekend, and he was really looking forward to being part of this, and I was very anxious to hear what he had to say, because he is, among other things, been in ongoing contact with these his fellow chairman of foreign relations committees in different NATO countries, and you know, it's still astounding to me that they 23 of them wrote that document and delivered that statement to Washington, basically pleading for the administration take some leadership role in getting things done for Ukraine at the summit. Maybe we'll have him on another time, but John, you're an ambassador. It seems to me that was rather unique to have people coming here pleading with us to take a leadership role.
It is unique. It's reflective of the problem that we described, that the administration, again, while putting together a policy that has prevented a Russian victory, which is a good thing, has not done it in order to ensure a speedy Russian defeat, which is not such a good thing. And Pavilionis understood that Washington has to do the right thing for this to turn out right. And so it makes sense for him to have organized a group of legislators from across Europe to make the pitch here.
Yes. And you made reference earlier, John, that Politico published today the a letter also urging the administration to do the right thing. Let's hope that it's read in the West Wing and maybe adhered to. Hopefully. Well, we're coming to the end of an hour, and I know that John, you needed to leave.
Right.
Phil has exited. Why don't I do a quick round of final comments and start with in the order we did before. Luke, why don't you go?
Thanks. I'll just quickly in my closing remarks, I'll just quickly address a question by Trudy of the Philadelphia Inquirer about how successful the counteroffensive can be without F-16 and ATACMS. The Ukrainian counteroffensive can be very successful. They can liberate huge sections of their territory without F-16s and ATACMS, but it's going to come at a higher cost, and it's going to take a longer period of time. This is why I think those saying that it's too slow fail to appreciate what the Ukrainians are trying to do without all the proper equipment and resources that they need to get the job done. Yes, the Storm Shadow that the British have provided can play an important role that the ATACMS could play, but it isn't a substitute for it by any means. And we just had to understand that the Ukrainians are launching this counteroffensive without all the capabilities that they need. And if believing otherwise is very naive. So I go back to my original point. Don't monitor Twitter 24 hours a day about the progress of the counteroffensive. Check back at the end of the summer or early fall to see the progress.
Thank you. Deborah?
Thanks. I endorse everything Luke said and a couple of other points here. If you really want this war to end faster, if you don't want it to play into the American political season, which tends to go on endlessly, then the best way is to fully arm Ukraine to end this faster. I mean, it's just simple logic at this point. So if you want to make a substantial difference and end this quicker, understanding that Ukraine doesn't have the personnel to throw hundreds of thousands of people at the Russians the same way the Russians do at Ukraine, because that would be this endless war of attrition. Then the way you do that is to give them the arms where they need to just end this faster. I personally think had we given, and if we even now decide to give Ukraine what it actually needs to end this war, this could be over before next spring. But our dithering is going to cause this to go on much longer and with countless more lives lost because we tend to dither.
Thank you, Deborah. John?
Two quick points. First, if you want to, I endorse what Luke and Deborah said. If you want this offensive to go well, if you want to be over quickly, you have to send the weapons. But we've already seen some modest success in the offensive. Ukraine has taken back approximately, actually over 100 square kilometers of occupied territory. And I've been saying all along that at a minimum, they will collect several hundred square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. Again, because we're not sending the more advanced weapons to have the better impact. That's point one. And point two, if you're advocating a negotiated settlement, and if you're saying in that negotiated settlement that, well, Ukraine may not be able to get back all of its territory, I don't endorse that. But you sure as hell better be ready to say at the same time, Ukraine needs to be part of NATO to ensure that its security is guaranteed for the indefinite future. But sadly,
John, thank you.
Okay.
But the ambassador has just joined us, and I'm starting to think maybe it was a time difference.
I've got to drop, but thank you, Bob. Ambassador Pavilionis, good to see you.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that I came so late. We have a lot of visits and preparations in Vilnius, so and I didn't hear the beginning of your talk, but you know me, for 15 years we are lobbying the same. I was in Bucharest NATO summit like a deputy foreign minister. I saw the mistake of French and Germans. Then America was standing behind us. Then President Bush was with us, asking for membership action plan. But we were isolated, we were blocked. Everybody was praising Putin's speech in Munich in 2007. Everybody was thinking that, well, most of NATO was thinking that NATO enlargement could provoke the war. And we see something else. We see that our inability to project our own policies, our strength, our weakness provoked wars, killings, occupations. But honestly, after a lot of visits now to different NATO capitals, including Washington 4 times, I feel quite a support on in all NATO parliaments. We have statement of 26 chairs of foreign affairs committees calling for clear path for Ukraine to be opened in Vilnius. I have a support of a lot of congressmen and senators on the Hill, and the only thing that I'm waiting now is the President Biden, our good old friend, the same Senator Biden who was lobbying our own membership in NATO. I hope he comes with different message than in Bucharest. I hope he will be greeted by all Lithuanians and thousands of Ukrainians in Vilnius. Vilnius will be full with Ukrainian colors. Actually, we're bringing hugely Ukrainian flag from Kiev itself. And we hope he will open those, this clear path to membership. We will decide on invitation, be it in Vilnius, be it finally in Washington NATO summit, but it will be the beginning of the road. Because if not, guys, we are next in the Baltics, and I'm sure that Xi will make the same Putin-type mistake in Indo-Pacific, and then we are all in hell. So, listen to the Baltics, as good Germans and Americans are saying. We are your litmus tests. We are your, front lines of freedoms. We feel it so well, and all our litmus test is going red. Do it now and send a message to Moscow. For Putin, Prigozhin, whoever is cooking whatever thing in Moscow, he would clearly get it. End of the game. You have no other reasons to continue because we have the end game strategy plan for Ukraine. Whatever you do, we step in. If you do that decision, political decision in Vilnius, from all my heart and all my experience of 30 years in, doing it, and you will end the war. Political decision only. But if not, if you repeat Bucharest, you are turning us into hell with all the consequences for NATO and rules-based order on a global level.
Well, thank you. Earlier when we started, I mentioned that you had led a delegation here to Washington. I shared screen just a minute ago. I'd done it earlier about the statement that had been put together by representatives of the legislatures of 23 different NATO countries. So a little bit of talk about that had taken place before. And we had all noted how unique it was that the superpower, the supposed leader of the free world, all these people are coming here and pleading for us to lead in this critical meeting at the summit. Deborah, do you have some comments to what the ambassador has said or questions for him?
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, it's great to see you again, and I'm so glad you could join. And I know things must be crazy in Vilnius right now. Totally understand. Thank you very much for your comments. I think I'll just say this. It is sad to me as an American that the U.S. is looking for leadership from Germany and not from itself. And I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but it won't be, as Luke knows, it won't be the first time I've gotten in trouble. And I just want to say that I'm just going to reiterate something I said earlier, Mr. Ambassador, when you were not on, which is that I think it's time for the countries that live in this nasty neighborhood to start leading themselves. And what I mean by that is, and this is advice that I have given to many of my friends who live east of Berlin. I've given it to very high level officials, and I'll say it again, which is that it is time to start cutting your own way and not waiting for the United States to tell you what is okay to do. You are full members of NATO. You're not junior partners, even though there are some in NATO who want to still see you that way. And it is time that you put up your own candidates for NATO Secretary General. It is time that you put up your own views of what needs to happen. And it is not necessary to build any more consensus with certain countries than certain countries who will remain nameless bother to get from you when they want to push something forward. And I think that you're strong, your militaries are strong, you're more committed, you have more capability and capacity than a lot of the other countries. You're doing more than your fair share of burden sharing in NATO. And I think it's time to move away from begging the Americans or asking US permission or asking German or French permission. I think it's time to start building your own coalitions within this alliance and just saying, this is what we want going forward. We are equal and full members. You are going to recognize us as such, and we're not going to play this junior partner game anymore. That's just my advice.
Can I just react?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm so sorry because I will have to run to meet President Duda. He is now in Vilnius already. Well, I would say I agree 100% with what you said. We have everything for leadership, and we lead, we fight, we help. But decisions in NATO taken by unanimous vote. And I really hate to imagine the situation that it will be this time not Berlin and Paris, but it will be Washington, D.C. that might block our willingness to defend Ukrainians with everything we have. We have to stop that game. Russians are trying different weakest chains. And if they get that veto to NATO enlargement through Washington this time, President Biden, we have 1 million of Americans of Lithuanian descent in America, more than 10 million Poles. Our coalition of Central and Eastern European who signed a letter to you, President Biden, represents 25 million of Americans. And we will be carefully looking to which candidate to vote, because we are voting today for Ukraine. We don't care who is Democrat or Republican. We want Ukraine to win. So President Biden, we hope this is your historic chance to be a Reagan of our region. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You said you have to go, right?
Yes, I have to join the dinner of my presidents. So sorry for this.
Okay. Well, we had done a lightning round at the end. Breedlove, Herbst had to get off earlier. But so why don't we end with that? And good luck with your meeting with the president. And we'll continue to press our.
I hope Vilnius will be a historic success, not a historic failure. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. All right. All right. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Let's all try and see what we can do to get our administration to step up as we head into the summit. Thank you. Have a good day. Goodbye.